Apparently, pro players think that we shouldn't be banning the One Ring, or at least Andrea Mengucci does. When someone this prolific talks about a topic like this, I think it's worth looking into because it's not just about making like devil's advocate arguments. It's kind of breaking it down as to the reasoning. And I think some of this is actually kind of interesting. And before we get into the whole thing, I just want to say this is an exploratory topic. I will make it clear that generally speaking, right now, I'm very much on the side of banning the One Ring. However, after kind of going through and prepping everything for this video, I am actually open to some of the alternate options. I think some of the arguments being made actually have sound reasoning to them. And I think a lot of ways, the One Ring is everywhere. It is ubiquitous. But if we kind of change the way that we think about Modern, then maybe that's where we can then move forward past the One Ring. I think one of my bigger problems with the One Ring is the fact that it is inaccessible. If the One Ring is going to be ubiquitous in the Modern format and every deck has to play it, I wish that there was a better reprint plan, an upfront plan to make it a universes within card that we could then use for every deck. If it wasn't a $100 card, I think less people would have a problem with it because again, it is just more accessible to the wide variety. But let's hop right into the tweet that has the Magic world a bit on fire. Andrea says that Modern isn't as good as it used to be. Very much a boomer statement. You love it. Like I almost want to title the video this way just to get the clicks. I see a lot of adversity for any content I make with the One Ring, which is fair. In many ways, people have talked about recently, especially with my shorts and a lot of the YouTube comments as well, how it feels like all I like to do is complain. Look, at the end of the day, complaining gets the YouTube algorithm to, get people to click on your video. And then I try and use that to create a positive spin. If you watch through the majority of my videos, I actually try not to complain. I just get y'all to click with the complaining. I think it's too good for the format and creates a negative environment. I don't like banning anything else from the energy deck, but I think it's a good deck to be the best deck in the format. So kind of breaking this down, right? So there's a lot of, but like people hate the fact that the One Ring is good. And as long as Andrea is making content around the One Ring, he's going to get some negative flack for it. And not necessarily like getting canceled, but like people are going to be like, oh, let's, play another deck, play another format or something. He thinks it's too good for the format and it creates a negative environment, which is fair. But he also thinks that, the energy deck being the best deck in the format actually isn't that bad. There's some mid-range components to it, but it's also an aggressive deck. But in that sense, it creates to him some better play patterns, which, okay, we're kind of gonna need to break down a little bit. So I think Alexander Haynes' response directly underneath can kind of like help elaborate on some of this. The gameplay of the energy deck is fine. I just hate that it's all Modern Horizons cards. Could just be something exactly like energy printed, but call something else and no cards would change. But yeah, the One Ring is likely too good, but it always was. Honestly, I have no problem with that. I realize that Modern is now an identity of a rotating format every 2 to 3 years whenever there's a Modern Horizon set, and it gets minor upgrades with new sets, and I'm okay with that. And Alexander then says, that's perfectly fine take, but clearly that's where we are now. I'm just too boomered and remember when there was a point where I was able to, use the old cards I love that left standard. And to be fair, one thing I want to point out is we need to get past that as a mentality. Right? Modern is way too old of a format. Let me just rip off the band-aid and say, you will not be able to purchase a deck right now and have it be long lasting. The thing is, you could do that in Legacy and Vintage because the original sets had cards that were so busted out of their minds that those are going to be the ones that dictate power in those formats. Think of Force of Will and Days, the police of the format, right? Those aren't cards that are seeing reprints into Modern, Pioneer, and Standard now. They dictate the power of the formats then. Modern is kind of like that first format where you have cards that are changeable. You can manipulate, you can create a profit margin for the Modern format. And so you're always going to see churn in it. And so especially for the tier 2 and 3 players and beyond, I think a lot of you can agree that there actually is a great amount of diversity in Modern, especially at the LGS level and outside of like, the big RCQs and stuff like that. You can actually see a great amount of diversity in the decks that you have. You see some small upgrades. You can play the One Ring, you can choose not to, and you can still do good things with it. I always think of decks like Mill and Merfolk, and heck, even some combo decks at the bottom end that can still see play based on pilot's skill and still see a relative amount of success depending on how you're able to manipulate that skill to your favor on the right day at the right time. And so at the top end is where we get these type of problems, where I think we get a lot of data that people get too sucked into, and they may not necessarily be playing too much at that high level. I don't play any, if at all, challenges, right? I play a lot of leagues. I kind of play a lot of gameplay outside of that with Commander in different formats. I'm not stuck at the upper end, but when I do play those leagues, there are a fair amount of them where I do run up against a meta, and you do have to play around it. You do have to ultimately play around the One Ring, and that is not something that I'm here to kind of ignore. The One Ring is everywhere. But the argument that the energy deck being the best deck in the format, I think at a baseline, I'm kind of here for. I get that. It's kind of like a mid-range aggro deck. I mean, it's mid-rangey really because of the One Ring. It has a comeback mechanic. It has Flage as well. But if you really think about how the deck plays out, there aren't too many ways to recur Flage more than like once in the Boros deck, at least, in a bit more in the Mardu deck. There aren't too many cards that are entering the graveyard consistently enough for you to recur it multiple times. So once it gets killed once, generally the game's evolved to the point where like you probably don't want to spend the mana to recur it again, but that goes, you know, kind of game to game. But it's an aggro deck outside of the One Ring, and it's generally okay for an aggro deck to be at the top, right? Or at least that's what I think, because aggro decks generally you just play more removal, you can play more life gain, like maybe there's like an angle that the aggro deck is trying to take against you. In the Boros energy deck, it's the One Ring, so you can play around the One Ring. But then again, the One Ring's problem to me is that it costs too much, and then also alongside of that, it's colorless, so it's played in every strategy, as I mentioned. So let's kind of break this down even further. The modern metagame, you know, we've kind of been through this a bunch. The One Ring is everywhere. You have, you know, kind of Mardu energy being up here, Boros energy being up here. One thing I'm really actually happy to see when I was doing kind of setting everything up for this video, Belcher being at the top at 4.4%. That's lit, right? Like, you know, like look at this, 7 days. In the past 7 days, Belcher's top 8% of the metagame. This is sick. Like, okay, yes, Boros energy, 21.5% of the metagame. If you add Mardu energy, the energy package is like over 30% of the metagame, arguably 35. You could add like Jeskai control in there because it abuses the energy package. So yes, I'm not here to ignore the fact that the energy is everywhere, but it actually may just be more so that it's not necessarily that the One Ring is the problem, because the One Ring is a comeback mechanic that many decks are abusing right now, the Eldrazi decks, you know, the Ami the Titan decks here. But it also might be the fact that energy is just an insane package, and this is kind of the idea of like design that is not building on each other, right? Like all the energy cards that are being played right now aren't being played from the original like Kaladesh set, right? It wasn't that we added energy cards over time. We created energy cards in a Modern Horizons 3 environment that are meant to work together. They are working in tandem. They're very low to the ground, very synergistic, very easy to cast, and they don't necessarily work with the other cards that have been printed previously or in those colors. This is Boros energy. You know, one of the energy cards that I think of is like a Tune to, I think it was Tune to Nature or Tune to Energy, and then Aetherworks Marvel, which are cards that are like, again, not that playable in these strategies, because alongside the other threats that were printed like a Johnny and Amped Raptor, those are the cards that are going to synergize in those colors, and so it works together in a finite package. It's almost like, again, if we didn't have all these energy cards, if we just banned Guide of Souls or something like that, if we banned Guide and Amped Raptor, the energy deck wouldn't even be playable. The One Ring would still be up there, but the One Ring wouldn't be strong enough, in my opinion, to get the energy deck to be up there. And right now, the Dimir Murktide deck has a pretty good matchup against those. The combo decks have a really good matchup against the Mardu and Boros energy decks, which is why you see Grinding Station, Belcher, and heck, you even see Living End still being played to that degree. And so there is actually a fair amount of rock, paper, scissoring happening in this case. Again, just really happy to see Belcher up at the top. But even with the most played cards in the format, I mean, folks, like the One Ring, Boros energy card, Consign, an answer to the One Ring, Flage, Boros energy card, Lightning Bolt, Boros energy card, Force Negation, stops the One Ring, Galvanic Discharge, energy card, Damping Sphere, stops the Tron decks. So there you go, stop Tron and the Storm decks, Giganta, Boros energy card, Static, Amped Raptor, Boros energy. Look at the creatures: Boros, 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 Boros sideboard, Mardu, Boros, and Mardu, and then Harbinger of the Tides, which is like pretty sweet as like a blue option. So again, the majority of the cards at the top of the metagame are energy cards. So if we were to keep the One Ring and reprint it to a point of accessibility and actually ban something out of the energy package, which is the Modern Horizons problem, maybe we would actually get a solution here. Because again, if we're to accept the fact that Modern Horizons is now the staple of Modern, right? You can build like the tier 2 or 3 tier 3 decks and upgrade your decks over time, which I find is actually true when it comes to those decks. Those decks have largely stayed the same. They've kind of waxed and waned in terms of viability, but that's just what it is. You can't have all decks viable at the same time. You will have eras where one deck is better than the other, and I've definitely seen that as a mill player, as a humans player, as an affinity player. Like, I've seen my decks wax and wane in a world of Orcish Bowmasters. Lord knows affinity is not a playable deck, and I mean, we got consigned to memory, which just makes it way worse. But when it comes to strategies waxing and waning, at the top of the metagame, there's constant churn with these Modern Horizons sets coming out. So why don't we address the Modern Horizons problem, which you could argue is also the Universes Beyond problem, which is also where we got the One Ring. And the reason I kind of equate the two is you want the Universes Beyond sets to sell. So on that basis, you would probably print higher than average, more powerful than average cards. But now that the Universes Beyond sets are actually being printed into standard, the power level that you want in standard is a lot lower. So in many ways, I actually think the Universes Beyond problem is kind of solved in terms of like the crazy powerful stuff that sells sets, because you're not going to get that with standard power level stuff. You might actually get those 1 to 2 cards that make a very big impact in like in the higher level formats. You'll get a lot of commander stuff, as with any set. It actually might be perfectly fine. So why don't we keep the One Ring, reprint it down into Oblivion, so it's really accessible, cost isn't a problem, decks are cheaper, but they still play the One Ring, and we can ban like something out of the energy decks, and Modern Horizons 3 still has kind of that level of impact. And then you still have like Orcish Bowmasters, which like kind of plays to it, which I guess could be an other problem, because Orcish Bowmasters, and the reason Mardu is good is because you want something like Orcish Bowmasters to be able to stop like this. I mean, Orcish Bowmasters also stops Obsolete Pride, it stops the Amp Raptor, it stops Ragavan. Like if you're gonna have cards that do stuff like this, then that's what it is. Look, this deck at the end of the day, it's a really powerful strategy. There's many cards in this deck that you could argue could be banned. If it wasn't the One Ring, my argument would probably be for Guide of Souls or Amped Raptor. Guide of Souls is a very good energy generator. I think something like the Galvanic Discharge is perfectly fine. It's like a pretty cool, like flexible energy removal spell. But when it comes to Guide of Souls in conjunction with Static Prison, that's where things get really dumb when you start playing cards like Ocelot Pride and Ajani. I think Ajani's perfectly fine. Ajani's a really cool, like kind of tokens, like go wide type of kind of planeswalker, legendary creature split. I think stuff like that is really cool. Flage, I think, is perfectly fine as well. The Titans are naturally really strong. If in the future they do get banned and it becomes like an Earl problem, sure. But I think like I would like to see this cycle completed more so than like let's ban Flage. I'm kind of excited to see the future iterations of something like that. But let's hop to another part of this around like aggro decks being at the top. So Golgari guy, very big on Twitter. I love a lot of their tweets here, talking a lot about kind of synergies and commander stuff. Agree 100% on the One Ring, but I don't agree on energy. An aggro deck shouldn't have a solid grinding plan with life gain and recursive threats, Flage and the One Ring, right? Also, too many of its cards are 2-for-1s. It makes all the aggro decks unplayable. And so this is where I think Andrea brings up something interesting. And I want y'all to really kind of think about this. Stop trying to make the other aggro decks playable. It was the reason for the Fury ban, and it was really bad. Other aggro decks aren't playable because they're not bad. They're bad, not because energy is better. Without the One Ring, mid-range can return, and the metagame can start metagaming again. So if we ban the One Ring, you know, mid-range can start mid-ranging again, and the metagame can return because you don't have these comeback mechanics where the aggro decks get all the kind of aggro cards back. But I think it's really interesting to say, you know, we don't want other aggro decks playable. The energy deck specifically being that style of aggro deck being at the top is good for the metagame because the Fury ban was there to police the creature decks. The problem was, I mean, herein lies the thing, right? The question is, we'll never know this reality, that ultimately Grief was the problem. But in a world where Fury was still a thing, would Grief banning have fixed the modern metagame, and leaving Fury behind would have been fine? I don't think so, because I don't think we want to get into a world of Rakdos where we still have Fury and Orcish Bowmasters around and creatures can't exist. I think like these decks, like especially like Orcish Bowmasters, really holds back like these aggro strategies, and then they later go into a back and forth discussion about, oh, go, don't you like Yawgmoth, the deck that's traditionally good against aggro? Golgari's talking about, I really like a format where 2 to 3 aggro decks are at the top. I personally, my bias as a mill player is always that, combo decks are at the top. So I kind of do like this metagame where the combo decks have a good matchup against the energy decks. And, every so often I can get off like a Crypt Incursion and something. I can ignore the One Ring because I don't care about the protection stuff. There's small things I do like about the metagame. So that's my personal bias. But I think it's interesting to say that the Fury ban was because the other aggro decks were good. If Fury wasn't around, then the other aggro decks would come back up, which isn't necessarily true because we still had Orcish Bowmaster stopping things, and Grief was an absolutely egregious card. So I'm not sure if this is true. I think it's like a really interesting point that if Grief and Fury were gone at the same time, would we have had this chasm of aggro decks coming back up to the top, before the energy package came in with Psychic Frog and, kind of uplifting the, changing the modern metagame where it is? Could we have had this world where modern was in this quote unquote perfect place where aggro was more playable? I don't know, like kind of food for thought in that sense. And, when it comes to aggro, we're talking about like cards like Burn that aren't really good right now with the kind of Boros deck at the top with all that One Ring stuff and, kind of giving you that protection, but also a lot of the life gain that you get in the main board with like Ocelot Pride, and you get the Flage and all that stuff. Bolt Wave is really interesting because it gives Burn another tool. It's just probably not going to be good enough. So it says Bolt Wave deals 3 damage to each opponent. So it gets around Leyline of Sanctity and stuff like that. It gets around other hexproof effects. And also it's just another like Lava Spike variant. So it probably replaces Rift Bolt in my opinion, but this says each opponent, so this doesn't target creatures. So that is one thing in Rift Bolt's flavor. And then also when it comes to something like my apologies there. When it comes to something like the Lava Spike can also hit Planeswalkers. But again, this is just like another Bolt at 3. It gets around the ley line, but it may not be exactly what Burn needs. And if Rift Bolts are going down, then I'm super happy as a mill player because my Tasha's stonks go up. If Burn is playable and they're not playing Rift Bolts, great. That is on average like 4 CMC completely out of the deck, which is great. We're gonna be singing all the way to the bank there. So Bolt Wave is something to consider in that sense. But let's be honest here. If we were to ban the One Ring and we were to ban something out of energy, we can't pretend like Psychic Frog isn't going to be at the top of the metagame. It's going to be one problem after another. And maybe the One Ring is what we need to stop the Psychic Frog decks. Maybe not. But that is the one thing I want to put out there. That if we alter, whether or not we choose to ban the One Ring, keep the One Ring and ban something out of the energy package, if the energy decks aren't played, Psychic Frog and blue is going to be at the top. And then we're going to start to look like a Legacy where, we may not have Reanimator at the top, but some type of Dimir strategy at the top. I was looking at the Legacy metagame the other day and I saw like Nadu combo. It's like a top 10 deck. I was like, hey, yo, like Modern Horizons 3 can't let any format chill. So Psychic Frog, just getting that discard, hypercharging Murktide Regents, drawing cards, like, you have some evasion kind of naturally tacked in there. This card does a lot, and you have some reanimation in that deck as well with like Abhorrent Oculus and just kind of that 1 mana black sorcery that you can cycle but also reanimate a creature with CMC 3 or less. I think this deck would be at the top of the metagame, which might create a whole other problem. And then it would kind of depend on how the Eldrazi decks do against these decks and how the combo decks do against these decks, because that is where, those decks will have some variety in where they ultimately land off. The Eldrazi decks are really good. They have a lot of mana. They have a lot of soul lands. Maybe they'll start adapting like Cavern of Souls and stuff like that alongside those soul lands, but it does make it kind of awkward. It does help with some of the green pips and stuff. But again, there are a lot of weird things that could happen out of the One Ring and energy being banned. It would completely shift out the modern metagame. It's not like when Nadu got banned and the metagame completely shifts, but like without the One Ring, Modern's identity fundamentally changes. And that's where I think like this argument is like really interesting. Like, I'm not really sure where he ultimately lands because I feel like he's kind of talking about some mixed things. Like he's talking about don't ban the One Ring, but I do think the One Ring is problematic. I don't know. Maybe just like he didn't like phrase these correctly. But to my understanding, he doesn't want the One Ring banned, but is also like, let's ban something out of the energy package, but is also okay with like energy as a concept being like one of the better decks in the format right now. Ultimately, I think a lot of people can agree it leads to some very bad play patterns. The One Ring being around leads to a lot of comeback mechanics, and just it feels like a lot of efforts that you make don't mean anything. People throw around the idea of restricting the One Ring. I don't think they would restrict the One Ring, because they've talked about the idea of precedence before with previous bans, and Gavin's talked about precedence when it comes to pre-banning cards and like Pauper and stuff. So the concept of precedence is there in the ban philosophy for Wizards of the Coast, and it's there for a lot of its front-facing designers and leads and all that stuff. So it's important to note that I don't think they want Modern turning into Timeless or Vintage. We don't need restrictions. We'll just ban things. Or we could unban things, which I'm more of a fan of. I think there are some cards on the Modern ban list that could be unbanned. Would they add to net positive gameplay? Probably not, but net positive gameplay is also a very subjective thing. The type of cards that are playable and not playable are going to be very, very kind of subjective, in the sense that I could think Glimpse of Nature could be unbanned in a world where Orcish Bowmasters are around, and you don't really I don't think Elves is going to make a comeback with Glimpse of Nature. There could be another combo deck that kind of makes the rounds with Glimpse of Nature, but again, there are these cards that we can explore and bring off the ban list, but of course it would be kind of more things to play around. But again, I am more for the ban list staying the same or decreasing than like ever increasing, because yes, there are some cards on there that ultimately should stay on there. They should never come back, like Uro and that 1 mana like snow artifact that I'm forgetting the name of right now. But there are other things that can come off. They can maybe provide an answer to the One Ring, maybe be faster, maybe be better, whatever it might be. But I think there's a home for any card out there. So let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Where do you ultimately land in this discussion of, should we ban something out of energy? What should it be? Should it just ultimately be the One Ring? Should it just be the One Ring and something out of energy? Maybe even the Frog? Let me know in the comment section down below.